Most of us would do anything to protect children. And yet, whilst knowing that children need safe spaces and places, well, many of us have decided to take a sledgehammer and knock a hole in the wall of some of those safe spaces and places. And we've constructed a window, presuming that the window will keep the child safe. But what has happened is that that window has allowed total strangers to walk up and look at what the child is doing. In fact, to hold up notes, hoping to communicate with the child. And sometimes, well, the child has reciprocated and written a note back and held it up so this total stranger can see. And in some cases, the stranger is able to shout through the window to speak to the child, and the child has responded. What on earth are we doing? Is this hellscape real? Well, yes, it absolutely is. Because, in case you haven't guessed already, we have the internet and we've allowed children access to it at extremely young ages, and very often there are no checks and balances on what they're looking at and who they're communicating with. I'm going to be quoting from what I think is an excellent book by Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist. The book is called The Anxious Generation. I'm not on commission. I think that Jonathan's work is well researched. You may or may not agree with it, and again, that's all fine, but I think he puts forward a compelling argument. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote from Jonathan himself as he describes, gives us a summary of the book. The link to the article I'm quoting from will be in the description to this video. So, from Jonathan, I begin The Anxious Generation, the book, by examining adolescent mental health trends. What happened to young people in the early 2010s that triggered the surge of anxiety and depression around 2012. So here we see a graph, and this is the percent of US undergraduates diagnosed with a mental illness. And it gives us percentage increases since 2010. I think this is up until 2020. Anxiety, 134% increase. Depression, 106%. ADHD, 72%. Bipolar, 57%. Anorexia, 100%. Substance abuse or addiction, 33%. Schizophrenia, 67%. There's none of that good. Some of these figures are absolutely astounding. And by the way, the source is the American College Health Association, and it is unlikely that these are far off the mark. Again, surveys, studies, estimates may not be exact, but I think that, shocking as those increases are, that is probably there or thereabouts in terms of absolute accuracy. The sudden increase wasn't merely due to a heightened willingness to talk about mental illness. The rise was showing up in behaviour as well, including self-harm, and that word that I'm not sure I can say on this platform. So you can read it there. Another graph, this time the percent of US anxiety prevalence, and the source is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. You will see that this is split into age ranges. And again, we're looking at the increases since 2010 until, well, I'd say on that graph, it looks like it's about, well, it's beyond 2020. So let's say up until at least 2020. 18 to 25, anxiety prevalence, 139% increase. Age 26 to 34, 103%. Ages 35 to 49, 52%. Ages 50 plus, 8% decrease, for whatever reason. So what happened to young people in the 2010s? The Anxious Generation, again the book, offers an explanation by telling two stories. The first is about the decline of play-based childhood, which began in the 1980s and accelerated in the 90s. All mammals need free play, and lots of it, to wire up their brains during childhood to prepare them for adulthood. That's absolutely true. Think here of a puppy, a kitten. What do? They want to play so many mammals, you will see when they're young, they're playing. What are they doing? They're learning sometimes how to hunt, how to protect themselves. They're learning about the strength and speed of others, the strength and speed of perhaps other mammals that are different species. They're understanding the social structure, where the threats are, where the opportunities are, where the comfort is. And then we go on back to Jonathan. But many parents in Anglo countries began to reduce children's access to unsupervised outdoor free play out of media-fueled fears for their safety, even though the real world was becoming increasingly safe in the 1990s. And you can probably recall yourself, or at least heard old people talking about it when we didn't have phones, or most people didn't have them. Actually, most people didn't have phones, but I'm talking specifically about mobiles. And you could go out at the start of the day and come back at night. And it doesn't mean to say that bad things couldn't happen, but most of the time they didn't. Most of the time, yes, whilst there could be incidents, by and large, touch wood, they were learning experiences. You begin to figure out all those things in a sense that those young other mammals found out. Strength, the limits of social structure, what it means to fall out with people. And again, all as often as not without adult supervision. And to throw something else into the mix, you may have read relatively recently that when children are exposed to dirt and grime, rather than a hermetically sealed and cleaned and bleached environment, then their immune system responds better when all that stuff that would allow them to repel things, toxins, let's call them, from the environment, when those aren't there to trigger that immune response, the immune system can grow weak and might not develop as it should. So that's in the mix as well. Plus, a lot of the time when kids used to go out, they were in nature, and we know how good that is for us. Anyway, the loss of free play and the rise of continual adult supervision deprived children of what they needed most to overcome the normal fears and anxieties of childhood. The chance to explore, test and expand their limits, build close friendships. Yes, remember those? Through shared adventure. Oh yeah, that's right. Remember the time we went down to the place and we imagined it was a pirate ship or a castle? Oh yeah, that was great. And learn how to judge risks for themselves. And like riding a bike, it does mean sometimes not being successful. But if you're going to create, to help develop balanced adults, they have to learn to judge risks. They have to socialize properly. They have to find out there are consequences of things, and it may be there isn't a parent immediately there to bail them out. So the article goes on. The second story is about the rise of phone-based childhood, which began in the late 2000s and accelerated in the early 2010s. This was precisely the period during which adolescents traded in their flip phones for smartphones, which were loaded with social media platforms supported by the new high-speed internet and unlimited data plans. The confluence of these two stories in the years between 2010 and 2015 is what Jonathan calls, the great rewiring of childhood. Few of us understood what was happening in children's virtual worlds, and we lacked the knowledge to protect them from tech companies that had designed their products to be addictive. For this reason, we ended up overprotecting children in the real world while underprotecting them in the virtual world. That's a very powerful and profound sentence. I'll read it again. We ended up overprotecting children in the real world while underprotecting them in the virtual world. And as we look around now at the unchecked, very often unbridled tsunami of information, some of it good, but some of it extraordinarily toxic and false and depraved, that children can access and be in contact with those total strangers through that electronic window. It is when you think of it that way around. Absolutely ghastly. It's absolutely appalling. Anyway, I shall continue with Jonathan's article. So I'm just going to put this in as an overview of his book. He talks about the various sections, the tidal wave, the basic stats of mental health of young people, the decline of play-based childhood that we've talked about, the lack of role models, damaging attachment systems, and erasing any clear path from childhood to adulthood, because that disappeared. I think there had been a relatively familiar process for a lot of people up until that point, but that changed almost overnight. The rise of the phone-based childhood. He talks about the harms resulting from it, a chapter devoted to harms to girls, a chapter on harm to boys, and a chapter on spiritual degradation that is happening to all of us, including adults, from our new phone-based lives. And I think that one of the things that Jonathan Haidt has pointed out is that for whatever reason, this is on average, boys will gravitate towards the games, very often shoot 'em up things. But within those games, they can, particularly these days, communicate in real time. And it's what Jonathan describes as synchronous communication. It's not the same as being in person. And boys have been affected by all this access to screens as well, but in slightly different ways. What girls on average seem to gravitate to is towards what Jonathan calls asynchronous communication, where they'll post like a photograph and wait on a reply, or maybe they reply to something. And so there are these differences again for whatever reason. Neither of them ultimately are healthier. There is a suggestion that at least the boys are doing something in real time, but there's also a suggestion that that's really pointless ultimately. They're not out there doing that in real time, in real life, being with colleagues, as it were, as children, forming that team, overcoming those obstacles. And of course, those teams may well include girls. And then again, we go on collective actions for better childhood. In this final section, I explain what we must do to reverse the damage. I explain how parents, school, governments, tech companies, and young people are trapped in collective action problems, and how these can be resolved when individuals organise and act together. And I think this is great because he's coming up with solutions. It's not all doom and gloom. Thank goodness. So let's then go on to what Jonathan suggests. So here's a quick takeaway, because I hope you read the book, I hope you tune into some of the stuff that this guy's doing, but given the fact that if you've listened and watched this video this long, I have you here, then let me at least share with you what Jonathan Haidt is suggesting in terms of solutions, because I think this is important, and I think we all should consider this. Give children far more time playing with other children. This play should ideally be outdoors in mixed age groups with little or no adult supervision, which is the way most parents grew up, at least until the 1980s. And again, I can be like, oh really, can we do that? Oh my gosh, different age groups. But remember what it was like if you're off that age group. Then you'll know there was a kid who maybe was older and therefore generally taller and stronger, but it teaches you a lot, or somebody who was younger and more vulnerable, and it teaches you also that they need to be protected, and the social dynamics, the intricacies of navigating those situations, those social groups, that social structure can pay dividends for later on in life. Look for more ways to embed children in stable, real-world communities. Online networks are not nearly as binding or satisfying. Absolutely true. They can be. Some studies suggest that getting online, particularly if people are lonely, can give a boost, can be a good, reasonable proxy for in-person relationships. And indeed, when people don't have access to those online relationships, their mental health can suffer. But even for those people, too long is not good. We should still limit that time. All of us, not just children, online. The attention spans are also being impacted. And if you think about it, when we introduce children to these devices and have introduced children to these devices, then their brains are different. They're forming the executive suite, if I could call it that, the prefrontal cortex, decisions, the ability to understand a little bit about emotions, maybe manage them. That's all forming. Our attention, our ability to top down our attention rather than bottom up our attention. Oh, let's look over here. Let me decide to do that. Let me hold my attention. Again, as these attention spans are reduced, diminished, eroded, think of it with that maturing brain where the connections, myelin is being laid down to help strengthen and promote connectivity. That can be interrupted. So what happens is children can grow up with an inbuilt lack of an ability to pay attention for as long. Now, it doesn't mean to say that can't be through neuroplasticity overcome, but it's not a great start. And it kind of, particularly in retrospect, makes a bit of sense, doesn't it? So anyway, real world communities, very, very, very important. What are we getting there? Again, it's more socialization. There's also risk. You can check out somebody's body language very accurately when you say certain things. You get immediate feedback from, hey, that idea wasn't that good. Oh, I shouldn't say that out loud. Or people seem to appreciate this. They appreciated me for that skill, etc. And some of that can be warped, diluted, distilled, and made odd when it is online. There aren't as many cues and clues available to us. We're seeing it through another window, essentially. And then, don't give a smartphone as the first phone. Give a phone or watch that is specialized for communication, not for internet-based apps. How clever is that? How important is that? How crucial is that? Because, of course, parents will worry, what, go outside or go away and I can't contact them? And that is a difficult thing to comprehend because we are so used to being in contact 24/7. But there's one solution. If they have to get a phone, make it a phone. Remember when we used to use these things to phone, and maybe it can text if that is required. But maybe you've literally got to take your time pressing those keys and be mindful of it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Don't give a smartphone until high school. Now, I think in the States that's sort of 15-ish. This is easy to do if many of your child's friends, parents are doing the same thing. Again, that's clever. Because it's hard to just do the stuff on our own. It's hard for us to go, we're going to be the one. And then there's peer group pressure. Look at what kids are like in terms of a pair of training shoes that, it's like, really? Wow, what's special about them? Oh, it's brand so-and-so. The routine. We can, as adults, fall into that as well, of course. But I think what Jonathan Haidt is saying here is that we need to do this as a community. It can start small. It can be a couple of families and then spread that out. Then it becomes the norm or more of the norm. And then delay the opening of accounts on nearly all social media platforms until the beginning of high school, at least. This will become easier to do if we can support legislators who are trying to raise the age of internet adulthood from today's 13 with no verification. What are we doing? To 16. Wow. Yeah, really mature. With mandatory age verification. Yes, so legislation, wherever it is, whatever country we're in, if your country is plagued by this, we need to support. And then, just to finish off, in The Anxious Generation, I, Jonathan, explain the major causes of the international epidemic of mental illness that hit adolescents in the early 2010s, and I offer a path forward for parents, teachers, friends and relatives who want to improve the mental health of children and adolescents. Change is possible if we act together, and I really like that. I just think I've alluded to this before, I've said before that I'm so pleased that he's put in solutions. I'm so pleased that there are things that I feel that we can collectively do, that we must do. We've been blindsided by a lot of this stuff, and as was mentioned in that overview from Jonathan, the tech companies design these things to be addictive. You know it yourself. You get something popping up. Oh, so-and-so liked what you liked. Oh, your friend is doing that. So again, another solution there is to turn those alerts off if that's what you want to do, if they're not hugely important to you. And all that stuff, I've talked about this before, fear of missing out. Missing out on what? A lot of it is nonsense. I think that here's a different way to think about it, and I'm talking here perhaps to adults. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't think that any one of these platforms loves you, that they are considering you specifically. You are a number to them. You are potentially income to them. You are potentially, in some ways, the actual product that they can offer to advertisers, etc. So spread the load. If you must do social media or connect, don't just get stuck on one platform. They can disappear, decide that you're not worthy, and take you off at the drop of a hat. And where it's all possible, be with people in person. Talk to them. Again, it can be remotely, but not necessarily through a social media app. It has its benefits, but I think that it is also up to the adults who have children, grandchildren, whatever, to show that, hey, this is what it was like. This is what it's like when you meet as a group. This is what it's like when we do things as a community. This is what it's like when people get together, and that buzz and that energy is totally different from anything online. And I really think that we have to rethink what we're doing with these kids. I saw a child the other day, not even 2 years old, skipping forward on an advert on a screen. And I thought, oh, you can look at that and say, oh, well, they're getting ready for the tech world that's ahead of us. Yeah, really? And what is that teaching them? What is that doing to the wiring? In of itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But when you pull the camera back and look at the bigger picture, insidious and invidious, dangerous, damaging, and ultimately a trap that we must not and cannot allow our children to fall into any longer.